everybody. Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Rigg at the Global Campaign for Education US. Welcome. We're so glad you could join us today. We have an outstanding discussion and meeting, and we're really delighted that you're all with us today. Please introduce yourselves in the chat box, sharing your name, your organization, if applicable, where you're zooming in from today. My name is Jennifer Rigg. I serve as Executive Director at the Global Campaign for Education US, based in Washington, DC in the USA. And we're really excited to kick off this discussion on the first day of February, as we will be covering a variety of topics today. Many of you know that the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring, or GEM report, recently launched with a focus on non-state actors in education. And so we're really delighted that fantastic experts are joining us on this topic. And GCE US Coalition member and leader, Katie Maloof-Boos, Senior Policy Advisor with Oxfam International, will be moderating a panel and discussion. As many of you know, Katie is such a wonderful expert on this topic. She leads Oxfam's education policy work globally, and has authored a number of reports and papers on global education financing, governance, and the role of the private sector, and specifically with a focus on education public-private partnerships, and the impact on education systems and equity. So we're really thrilled that you're all here with us today. Please do join the conversation. We want to hear from each of you. And after the discussion, we're delighted to be welcoming new coalition member Humanity and Inclusion, and really thrilled to hear from colleagues at HI about the fantastic work that they do on inclusive education. We're also grateful to have a chance to learn from some of the latest call to action items that actually was just published by the Global Disability Summit Secretariat, and we'll share that with all of you. Just a few weeks ago, many joined the Inclusive Education Thematic Workshop on the way to the Global Disability Summit in mid-February. And we're also grateful to many of you who shared your input on USAID's local capacity development policy. So we'll give some updates there, but we also want to hear from all of you about what events are coming up, what things throughout 2022 you're looking at, what joint advocacy on the human right to quality inclusive education for all that you'd like to collaborate around. And so we'd love to hear from each of you today. So with that, I'll pass it over to Katie, who will wonderfully be moderating this discussion, and we'll make sure that you all have the links as well to have at your fingertips the new Global Education Monitoring Report on non-state actors in education. Welcome, Katie.
Well, hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Jennifer and Krista, for inviting me to moderate this discussion. And thank you especially to Priya Joshi from the GEM report team and G2 Brown from Journey for Justice for joining us for this conversation. It's really awesome to have both of you here with us. And I'll introduce them both in just a minute. But just a few quick thoughts on this report and the topic of non-state actors in education and the growth of private approaches in education, which I think is incredibly timely right now. We have, in the context of COVID, real impacts happening in terms of the state of public education and the growth of private actors. We're seeing private school closures in many countries especially during the first part of COVID, affecting students' access to education. During the lockdown, we've seen fee hikes in private schools and failure to pay teachers. And some of these problems have also been, of course, problems in public education. We're seeing a context of real current and coming austerity and budget cuts for public education, that are going to have serious implications for the quality of public education globally, as well as the attractiveness of private sector and private schools. In the broader educational context, I think beyond COVID and even predating COVID, there have been rising concerns about the growth of private actors in education, particularly with regards to for-profit actors, and particularly as it relates to the negative impacts on equity and inclusion. So as many of you know, have been advocating on these issues for a long time. A number of global institutions have recently, for example, instituted limits on funding to for-profit private schools, including the World Bank's International Finance Corporation, the IFC, the Global Partnership for Education, GPE, and the European Parliament, acknowledging particular concerns about the role of profit-making in education. But of course, the spectrum goes beyond for-profit schools. There's also growing concerns about socioeconomic and racial segregation and stratification in more privatized education systems, and particularly with a model of education that's been growing in popularity, the public-private partnership, or PPP. In other words, when the government contracts out public schooling to private providers. So at Oxfam, we've been looking at this issue for quite some time. Several years ago, we conducted research together with several partners looking at the impacts of PPPs, of public money funding private schools to provide education, especially on equity. And in our review, we found serious concerns in the literature about the negative impacts on inequality and exclusion, while at the same time, a lack of evidence that outcomes are necessarily better in PPP schools. And case studies in several countries have told similar stories. So I think in that context, this report is particularly important because it helps us understand what the evidence says and sort of interpret the literature about this issue. And I really appreciate the title of this report, Who Chooses, Who Loses, which I think really gets at the challenges of this issue and breaks down the narrative that school choice necessarily serves everyone. And I think a lot of people would argue that despite the attractive appeal of the school choice kind of idea, it is more likely to be a tool for segregation and exclusion. So I appreciated the framing and the care that this report has taken to examine issues of access and inclusion and equity in the context of private education. And of course, its recommendations are very relevant for many of our advocacy targets, as I just mentioned, and the use of public aid money, including also USAID. So without further ado, I want to hear what the report has to say. And I want to start by introducing our speakers. I think I'll do them sort of one at a time, right as they speak. So we'll start with Priya Joshi from the Global Education Monitoring Report team. She's a senior project officer there. We're delighted to have you with us today, Priya. Priya has led the GEN Report's work on non-state actors in education and the role of education in other development outcomes, such as gender equality and inclusive cities since 2014. I will struggle to summarize her bio as it is so incredibly impressive. But her background's in education policy, economics, and public policy. She has a PhD in education policy from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's in public administration in economic policy from Princeton, and undergraduate degree from Amherst. She previously held positions at the IMF in the Western Hemisphere Department, where she coordinated the Regional Economic Outlook. She's done consultancies at UNICEF and the World Bank Human Development Network. Her personal research, which builds on her dissertation, focuses on the system-wide consequences of private school growth for the education system, using perspectives from public schools, parents, and private schools. She has authored papers in a number of journals, including Comparative Education Review, Compare, International Journal of Educational Development, Prospects, and the European Journal of Education. So, thank you so much, Priya, for being with us, and we're excited to hear more about the report's findings.
Thank you, Katie. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you for the lovely introduction to both the report and for myself. This is a very short presentation on the report's findings and recommendations. I really urge you to read it and engage with our full contents, and really excited to be here. Next slide. I wanted to start with the question of why we needed this. And of course, this audience is very aware of this. The framework for action, our roadmap for achieving SDG 4 has acknowledged the crucial role non-state actors play in education, and that governments could not go it alone. However, there have been heated debates on what the contributions of non-state actors are and what they should be. The reality of non-state actor activity was so complex, and so much had to be analyzed. We needed to understand the extent of non-state provision, of financing, of their influences, how they are regulated. We needed to analyze issues across other levels of education, which do not receive as much focus. We needed our guiding lens to be on equity and inclusion, and the government's responsibility to fulfill its right to education. At the end of the day, the rallying call of who chooses, who loses is an invite to policymakers to really question relationships with non-state actors when they are faced, with fundamental choices of policy design. And it's also an urge so that they can see, it's also a request to see all institutions, students, and teachers as part of one system. So, the system, the public good aspects, that's what we wanted to emphasize. The next slide. Given today's audience, we wanted to also highlight that civil societies are acknowledged time and again as advocates of strong regulation and oversight. As Katie mentioned, they played a major role in drafting and adopting in February 2019 of the Abidjan Principles. Another substantive change that was achieved was when the IFC froze investment in private fee charging pre-primary, primary, and secondary schools, which has been acknowledged in the report, a decision that came after years of struggle and pressure. Of course, much work still needs to be done, because profit making is still not a focus of regulatory activity still. Next slide. We conducted a survey for this report from GC members. And while most members prioritize pressuring governments to ensure that the non-state actors do not violate the right to education, what we find is that civil society actors and their views on whether non-state actors should be providing are quite diverse. So of the 49 respondents, 43% expressed a negative view of for-profit education, but 16% were supportive. And while 35% had a negative view of PPPs, 31% were supportive. Of course, most organizations were supportive of nonprofit work, appreciating their contribution to supporting children in hard-to-reach areas. Next slide. And I feel like the diversity of these views is also indicative of the diversity of the realities on the ground. We commissioned a first major analysis on how the general public feels about public provision. And we found that 9 in 10 people in 34 middle and high-income countries said that the primary responsible for providing education is with the government. However, when you look at sort of the tail end, in Philippines, Chile, and the United States, the ratio is lower. And in the extreme case of India, less than half of the people share this opinion that the main responsibility for providing has to rest with the government. Next slide. I share this video now to share local voices on these different realities at different levels of education from around the world.
We have close to around 12 million people entering the workforce every year. The skill development problem cannot be solved by the government alone or neither by the industry alone.
Many of them are school leavers, college leavers. They need jobs and they are ideally suitable for entry-level jobs. To train them and put them in jobs, all the partner stakeholders need to work together.
मैंने सोचा कि बहुत अच्छा मौका मिला है मुझे क्योंकि ये बिल्कुल फ्री है। ये मेरा फर्स्ट स्टेप है क्योंकि मेरा बचपन से ही सपना रहा है कि मैं डॉक्टर बनूं।
The choice of schools available to low-income families is not nearly as good as the choices available to those wealthier families.
The reality is that the choice of a world-class neighborhood school within safe walking distance of my home was snatched from me.
As education privatization increased, African American students were increasingly segregated into low-income and uniracial schools, due both to an increase in charter schools and to public school closures.
때부터 그런 혜택을 받았다고 할 수 있어요. 환경의 영향인 것 같아요. 본인이 욕심이 있고 또 어떻게 성취하고 싶은 목적이 있다면은 더 원하게 되는 경향이 생기는 것 같습니다. 이게 공교육이 꼭 부족해서라기보다는 여기서 좀 더 잘하고 싶다는 경쟁 의식.
A minha maior preocupação quando eu decidi me formar em recursos humanos utilizando o FIES já foi como eu pagaria. É muito assustador você ter a ideia de que você está fazendo um curso para pagar ele depois de 2 anos ali no contrato, sendo que você não tem certeza de que você vai arrumar um emprego dali 2 anos.
Ndi mukyala muzadde nina abaana 6 nezigyayo ssente netwala abaana ku masomero ne babeera nga basoma nga nze bwe nnoonya emirimu gye nkolaakola okusobola okusasula ssente z'okuzizaayo.
Government of Uganda is not financing universal primary education or universal secondary education as it is supposed to. Education is a public good which government should try as much as possible to ensure that each and every person or child gets the opportunity to access.
We should be reimagining public education, having conversations in neighborhoods all over the country.
Daqui a alguns anos, eu espero realmente que no Brasil as pessoas que não tenham dinheiro para cursarem em uma universidade privada ou para pagar o curso, ou realmente precisar investir muito em educação no Brasil, elas tenham mais acesso.
Thank you. So yeah, to turn now to the next slide, the case of the United States. It is the most well-researched context on this topic and a rather unique context. The scale of non-state provision has been growing since early experimentation with vouchers. In 2018, 7% of public schools were charter schools. 3% of students are homeschooled, which is the world's largest share. One thing to note is that the research on the impact of private schools or Catholic schools, charters, vouchers in the US is immense. Thousands of books have been written on this topic, but overall it ends up boiling down to mixed or varied results. It depends very much on states. There's some sort of overarching findings, like if it's a virtual charter network, charter school, doing online schooling is usually a huge negative impact on achievement. If there's the more no excuses, like more focused on outcomes, charter schools, they have some better outcomes. Nonprofit charter networks do better than for-profit charter networks. But overall, that is more the details, I guess, on the outcomes. The real fundamental issue is the question of the broader systemic challenge. And district level data shows that segregation of the poorest students in the country has increased by 15% in the largest districts between 1998 and 2005, with the presence of charter schools being one of the key factors behind this. And another key factor of the US is this federalist system, because education is funded through taxes, at the federal and state and local level. What it means is that education is strongly tied to socioeconomic status and location, and the rules vary so much across states. And Jitu, of course, will talk more about this, I'm sure. Next slide. And this expansion really is a product of a growing influence over decades of groups who are more supportive of this idea of collaboration, but now more and more, as Katie was mentioning, of private involvement, of like for-profit education. Foundations and business actors are very active in pushing for, let's say, technology as the solution, even as teachers' unions, and other advocacy networks generally oppose these developments. Politicians have been found to be receiving many generous donations from for-profit companies. As a donor, the U.S. Through USAID is quite positive about private sector engagement. And besides compulsory education, I think what is really dramatic, these influences have been quite dramatic for tertiary education. Profit maximizing universities have been linked with major corruption. 7 of the 10 biggest for-profit companies have been found guilty of deceptive business practices in the US. Student outcomes, of course, are not a priority when there's such a focus on profit. But I guess, something that we all read in the headlines and are very aware of is that student debt nearly tripled between 2007 and 2019 to US, $1.6 trillion in the US. So essentially, the US is a pioneering and a dramatic case of the global challenges that result from the idea that non-state actors ought to be involved in education. Our report makes 5 recommendations for establishing and enabling policy and regulatory environments built on standards, information, incentives, and accountability, so that all contexts, including the United States, develop more inclusive and equitable systems, incorporating the non-state role. Next slide. The first recommendation reminds countries to fulfill their commitment to make 1 year of pre-primary and 12 years of primary and secondary education free. Publicly financed need not mean publicly provided, but governments have to ensure the same conditions for all students. To do this, governments need to monitor out-of-pocket household expenditures and also emphasize equitable policy design. Government-funded schools should not charge fees, but we find that only 67% of countries regulate non-state provider fees. Schools should not select students, yet only 55% prevent selective admission. There should be no profit making in primary and secondary education, yet only 27% of the countries explicitly ban profit making. Next slide. The second recommendation is about establishing quality standards that apply to all states and non-state education institutions. Standards should cover not just inputs, but also processes and results. Teachers should be valued as professionals in all schools, and there should not be so much variation, based on where you work, like the type of provider you work at. Quality assurance mechanisms should monitor and enforce these standards. The growing phenomenon of private tutoring, for example, should not negatively affect systemic equity and quality. However, only half of countries currently regulate private tutoring at the moment. Next slide. Third, we should also apply common monitoring and supporting processes so that equity and inclusion standards are met for infrastructure, curricula, learning materials, or teacher certification. Regulations and practice are often impractical and are not protecting the disadvantaged. Governments need to have a clear vision on how to engage with non-state actors on this issue, see them as partners, and be honest about the causes of the phenomenon they're trying to regulate. We need simple, transparent, and efficient regulations that will actually be executed. The last 2 recommendations are related to ideas. It is very important for governments to help innovation spread through the education system. No one actor has a monopoly on good ideas, but there should not be like this, focus on outcompeting each other in education. There should be nurturing of innovation in the public education systems around the world. The government must ensure that good ideas are shared, tested, adopted broadly. And finally, we need to maintain the transparency and integrity of public education policy processes. We need to give all voices equal chances to be expressed and influence policy. And we have to acknowledge power differentials. We need to monitor and safeguard against lobbying and revolving door practices. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and look forward to your reactions to the report today, and also using the hashtag Write the Rules. Thank you.
Great, and thank you so much, Priya, for that fantastic overview, which was both brief and very informative. I know many of us will have questions about a number of the findings and pieces of information that was shared. So think about your questions, and we'll take questions in a few minutes. Next, I am very honored to introduce G2 Brown, someone who has been on the front lines of defending public education in America. So G2, it's wonderful to have you with us today. G2 is the National Director of the Journey for Justice Alliance, which is a network of grassroots organizations in over 30 cities in the US, organizing for community-driven school improvement. And he was formerly the education organizer for the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization, or COCO, if I pronounced that right. Got it right, good. He was born and raised in the Rosemore neighborhood on the far south side of Chicago, and he is a product of Chicago Public Schools. G2 studied at Eastern Arizona College and Northeastern Illinois University, and he started volunteering with COCO in 1991, where he later became a board member and then served as the organization's board president. He has organized in the Kenwood, Oakland neighborhood of Chicago for over 22 years, bringing community voices to the table on school issues. He helped develop the Mid-South Education Association, a grassroots advocacy group made up of administrators, parents and teachers, young people, and local school council members. And he has been on the front lines of dealing with school closings and the elimination of community voice from the decision-making process in public schooling. So one big piece of his resume here that is super inspiring is that in 2015, G2 was the organizer of the historic Diet High School hunger strike, which lasted for 34 days and resulted in the reopening of Diet, which is a public arts high school, as an open enrollment neighborhood public school with over $16 million in new investments. So G2 has really been on the front lines of defending public education in the US. He's been published in national education magazines, Rethinking Schools, and the Washington Post, the New York Times. He's appeared in Ebony Magazine and on a number of talk shows, including on MSNBC, Al Jazeera America, Democracy Now!, etc. So it's very difficult to summarize his bio, but G2, we're thrilled to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to just say, stop when you're reading all that stuff, but it's okay. Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be here. I'm really inspired with the opportunity to really talk about the impact of privatization. And I think with today being the first day of Black History Month, I have a charge to do my ancestors proud. So I'm gonna do my level best. So for the Journey for Justice Alliance, I want to make it clear that this alliance was formed because other cities had begun to experience what we had been dealing with in the Bronzeville neighborhood on the south side of Chicago since as early as 2000, really as early as 1999, as they began to tear down housing projects and then close schools, public housing projects. But an official program, which was called the Mid-South Plan, which was a plan to close 20 out of the 22 schools in my neighborhood, was launched in 2003. So we had begun fighting for this before the notion of school closings as a public policy had spread throughout the country. And I think one should ask themselves, well, how did this group form with no grants? This was not a philanthropic exercise. This was mothers and fathers and community members who just felt silenced and felt the sting of inequity, looking for someone who could feel our pain and not tell us that we didn't know what we were feeling. And so Journey for Justice Alliance started with really 12 cities having conversations. And while we initially formed to stop school closings and privatization, we developed into an alliance that began to move an equity and education agenda. So the first thing we did was we came up with, we said, what is education to us? To the parents, to the young people, to the teachers, community members that made up the Journey for Justice Alliance. And the definition that we developed is that education is inspiration and information that inspiration and information that prepare young people to impact the world. That it's not about our young people being able to complete a bubble test and just scratching a number, but that we want our children to actually be the people who inherit this society. And for Black people, that has always been our reality. We viewed education as a way to escape oppression. We viewed education as a way for us to somehow get out of the suffocating smoke of a society that told us that we were not human. One of my favorite movies that illustrates this point is The Great Debaters. If no one has seen it, please do, with starring Denzel Washington. But that movie really captures the essence of what was the fight for education about in Black communities. If we know our history, we know that for African Americans, it was actually an act of activism that created public education for us, which was the partnership between abolitionists, Quakers, and the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which created the African free schools. These were the first schools we were able to attend. And so these were efforts against government policy and public discourse to say what we wanted to see in our schools. So Journey for Justice Alliance is now a national alliance that's committed to equity in public education. And we recognize that the biggest problem in public education in the United States is that America has never honored her equity mandates. Whether it was the Brown versus Board of Education, the equity that was supposed to come with the Elementary Secondary Education Act, the full funding of Title I, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which has been underfunded by billions of dollars. America has never honored her call for equity. As a matter of fact, the school choice movement was born out of a resistance to that mandate. Senator Harry Byrd from Maryland initiated what was called a campaign for massive resistance to Brown versus Board. And white families organized school choice, where they pulled their children out of the public schools so that they did not have to go to school with Black children in several school districts across the United States. So school choice was never about civil rights. It was never about trying to do right for Black children. It was born out of this baseless hatred for another human being. That United States senators, you know, not guys sitting in the back of a pickup truck, but United States senators moved as we must fight this mandate to move towards equity in public education. And let's be clear, my ancestors did not call for Brown versus Board or the Civil Rights Act out of some maniacal desire to go to school with white people. It was really saying, well, if maybe my child can go to this school, then they don't have to go to the bathroom outside. Maybe if my child can go to this school, they can actually have a book instead of writing on their arm with rocks because they don't have chalk. You know, maybe that my child can have a different reality. So, because the civil rights movement was all about access to resources and opportunity. So this report that you all see on the first screen, we did in partnership with the Advancement Project to really capture the voices of mothers and fathers and community members who had been subject to school closings and school privatization. So that's why we called it Racism, School Closures, and Public School Sabotage, because we knew that America knows how to educate children. There's just a particular population that this country refuses to provide equity for or provide equitable access to resources and opportunity. So this report is available on our website, www.4jalliance.com. You can easily find it on Google. And this is the report that the NAACP used to actually call for their moratorium on school closings, which was a big moment. in our work. We can move to the next slide. And this report we released in 2018 called Failing Brown v. Board, where we just did something very simple. We said you can look at the intent by looking at the course offerings. Remember, if we say education is inspiration and information, that means that every child must have opportunities for inspiration, right? Does a child have world language? Does a Black child actually get to go to school and realize that most of the people in Brazil look like him or her? Does that child get to understand that there are people in Paraguay and Uruguay that look like them, in Cuba? Do they get the chance to understand that they're actually part of a global family, or that the only reason why a person in Cuba speaks Spanish and they speak English because the people that stole us spoke those languages? But if we were walking down the same street, you couldn't tell us apart? Do they get to develop a worldview? Do they have access to technology? Do they learn robotics? Is there a teacher aide in every classroom? What's their class sizes? Do they have access to cultural clubs, debate teams? These things, when we studied across the country, the results were obvious, that white children had far more access. And there's no, I want to say this, there's no acrimony towards children that have access to these resources. Those babies deserve it. So I don't want to get caught in that trap of saying somehow somebody twisting this to say that I'm saying that those children don't deserve that. They do. Because if we lead with love, all children deserve it, right? So that I'll never have an issue with any child having access to being able to stand on their parents' shoulders. But the denial of another child, imagine sabotaging a third grader's education. Imagine a third grader, a baby that still has imaginary friends. Imagine policy that you know sabotages their child's future. That's what was discovered in that report. In this report, we basically just said that denying children access to inspiration is the sabotage of their future. Because the responsibility of educational institutions is to provide those moments of self-awareness where that child realizes that they can. For me, it was a teacher named Miss Coleman, my fourth grade teacher, who realized that I was a communicator and began to give me Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, County Cullen, and making me read poetry and putting me up in front of people. I didn't know what she was doing. I was a little kid with big, thick glasses, little chubby kid on the south side of Chicago. But that teacher saw something in me that was not in the curriculum. It was in her observation of her students. And she was trusted with the development, with her expertise to be able to develop those children. Every teacher must have that opportunity. And the denial of that opportunity, sisters and brothers, is evil. To sabotage the education of a baby is one of the worst things that a human being or society could do. It is evidence of the decay, the moral decay of a society. So when we look at school privatization, what's been the impact? We can go to the next slide. This is also available at our website. And what we've learned is that in every city where the privatization industry has taken root, the number of Black teachers has diminished. In some cities, plummeted. In New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, 7,000 teachers, over 60% of them Black, were fired. Most of them could not come back to New Orleans, right? And now the teaching force in New Orleans is mostly young white women who tend to not stay as long, who tend to, whether they teach for America, graduates or wherever they come from, stay in the school for 2 to 3 years, then go back to their home district. In Chicago, in the year 2000, the teaching force was 44% African-American. Today, it is 21%, right? Every city, Oakland, California, Denver, Colorado, we can look, New York, we can look at the numbers, that the impact of the privatization movement, where they fire the entire teaching force, and then hire the teachers that are less expensive, we have seen the loss of teachers. When we know that research tells us that children learn better when a teacher has cultural competency. All right, so we know that other things, you know, and I appreciate Priya's presentation, but I want to add just this point as she was talking about what the data says. We know this. This has been reported from Stanford University to the University of Colorado to wherever you want to look, that only 1 out of 5 charters outperform traditional public schools. When the smoke clears, they're batting 20%. So for athletes in the world, if folks that love American football, if you are a quarterback and you only complete 1 out of 5 of your passes, or if you're a baseball player, you only get a hit 1 out of every 5 times you come to the plate, would you stay in the lineup? And to quote Dr. Charles Payne, who's now with Rutgers University, he said that the charter school movement is not reform. They are mediocre interventions that are only accepted because of the race of the children served. We know this. We know that in many cases, nonprofit and for-profit charters have been harmful. They've used schemes in order to cook the books to make them look more effective, because when they go to the school board at the end of the year, they want to make their portfolio look more attractive so that they can get more schools. If that is the drive, then that corrupts the education mission. And so there are institutions like Urban Prep, which is based in Chicago. Urban Prep is held up as one of the greatest examples of what school choice can do, because it's an all-male school. It started by a gentleman named Tim King, who I knew well when he was a principal at a Catholic school. I ran a mentorship program in his school building. So I have a relationship with Mr. King. And, but Urban Prep, while 100% of their graduates went to college, left out of the discourse that only 41% of their freshmen make it to their senior year, which means that they are a sausage grinder. They push out the young people that are more difficult to educate. There are other schools, Harlem's Children's Zone, which was lauded with Jeffrey Canada, which is lauded as the model of integrating social services or wrapping social services around the children, which is a model that works. But of course, in that process, hiring younger teachers, not having union protection. And what we learned is that in the first 3 years at Harlem's Children's Zone, they pushed out an astronomical number of children in order to make their portfolio look more acceptable. Same thing with Noble Street Charter School Network in Chicago, which former Mayor Rahm Emanuel lauded as the secret sauce to education. Well, it was discovered by a youth activism group called Voices of Youth in Chicago Education that Noble Street Charter School was fining children for things like not having a belt, not shaking your hand when you walk in the building, having an argument. And so they targeted particular children, and they were fining children to the tune of $400,000 a year. So what would happen is if a child who they knew would make their portfolio look worse had a certain amount of money in fines, they would just counsel the child out of the school building. This was exposed. It was reported in WBEZ and the Chicago Tribune, and Noble Street Charter School has now issued an apology. But why should private operators have the opportunity to run scams on taxpayers? What we want is equity. America has done everything except for equity. Online charter schools, virtual schools, schools in the basement of churches, everything but making sure that every child had equitable access to resources and opportunity. So what we recognize in the case that was mentioned in Dyett High School is that the only way for this to change is if we organize to make sure that there is grassroots demand for something better. The reason why we fought for Dyett High School was not only for the high school, was because there was no pre-K through 12th grade system of education for the children in our neighborhood. And And being that we were 10 minutes from downtown Chicago, right off the lake, Dyett High School was the original, the proposed location of the Obama Presidential Library. And so we knew that if the Obama Presidential Library came into our neighborhood, that we would be pushed out, that gentrification would really be accelerated. So that is why we organized to fight and win Dyett High School, because we wanted infrastructure for the families in our neighborhood. We can go to the last slide, and I know I've been talking for a while. Let's go ahead one more, and one more. Now those three slides just make the point that there have been examinations of societies that privatize versus societies that focus on equity. And so we know across the board that societies that focus on equity do better than societies that privatize. If we look at Chile and we look at Cuba, we see two completely different realities, right? If we look at the United States and we look at Canada, we see two different realities. Let's go. And so what we're calling for is massive expansion of community schools. We believe that a partnership, simply kind of, I guess you could say phrase like this: community wisdom in partnership with academic expertise leads to school improvement, where everybody is involved. The school community is involved in envisioning what the future should be for their children, because we believe that people fight for what they help to build. So what we're doing right now is we are actually organizing with parents, and we are lifting up grassroots voices as unprecedented investment through the American Rescue Act. Once in a lifetime investment is coming into American cities. What will happen to those resources? If it is not guided by grassroots demand, and if it's not driven by what people believe they need in their communities, then it will do what it has always done, which is those resources will go to fuel to continue to remove us from urban spaces. So September the 20th, we can go to the last slide. I believe it's, yes, September 20th and the 21st. We've done over 120 listening sessions already. We're doing them all over the country, where we're asking people pretty much, what is your vision for public education? But we're also saying, what's your vision for housing? What's your vision for healthcare? What's your vision for food production and delivery systems? Because we understand that the foundation of any nation are the institutions that lay the structure for the people's development. The way you destroy a community is you destroy their basic quality of life institutions. The way you build a community is you invest in those institutions. Those institutions train you on how to be treated. They train you on what your citizenry means. So September 20th and 21st, we are having a quality of life festival at Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. And because our belief is that in this moment, when once in a lifetime investment is coming into American cities, shame on us if we don't become the conscious constituency to demand what needs to come. Now, the story of Dyett, as we went through it very quickly, and I apologize for being long, but the story of Dyett High School is not an anomaly. It is a blueprint of what needs to happen to inspire people in grassroots communities to stand up and defeat very powerful interests. I want to say this again. This was the site of the Obama Presidential Center. It no longer is. The Obama Presidential Center is being built 2 miles to the south, because a group of organized and committed parents and young people on the south side of Chicago, we defined ourselves through our lens, not through the lens of those who oppress us. And we maintained a resistance that beat one of the most powerful Democrats in the United States, which is Rahm Emanuel, a major fundraiser for the Democratic Party. So I want to make that type of commitment is a blueprint. You can build grassroots demand. We must have faith in the power of people to actually envision and shape their own future. If we don't have that faith, then we won't make change, because change never comes for transformation from the top. It is always generated from those who have the least. Those that are closest to the pain must be closest to the power. And thank you very much for providing this space this morning.
Thank you so much, G2. That was just incredibly inspiring to hear your experience working on the south side of Chicago with communities there, just defending public schools. And I think this is a real inspiration and a model for what can be happening in other places around the globe, because I think this is really, I mean, the distressing thing about this is that, or perhaps the unifying thing about this is that we are facing a lot of the same issues around the world, that the US and sort of one of the wealthiest countries in the world isn't really all that different from many lower income countries in terms of the issues that we're facing in education and the pressures that our education systems are facing. A lot of the same issues, a lot of the same interests and political forces are being seen in other countries. Sometimes they're even the same, the global networks of education companies, for example. And we're also seeing educational ideas from the US being exported to developing countries, and sometimes not our best ones. So as we've seen, for example, in the public-private partnership in Liberia, where an American for-profit school was going to be taking over all of the public schools in Liberia. Now that was scaled back, and it's a longer story that I won't get into at the moment. But I think that Jitu, your remarks really helped to contextualize the important issue that we're facing here, and that the findings of this report, I think, are also super relevant to a lot of the things that you've raised. And if I can just, as a moderator, take a few minutes very briefly to reflect on what I think are also some of the most important findings of this report, and then think about what your questions are. We're going to go 5 minutes past the hour for this discussion. And I'd like everyone to either get ready to ask a question. You can put a star in the chat if you want to, or raise your hand, or you can type your question in the chat. And then in a minute, I will take a round of questions. But I just want to, I mean, I think one of the things that Jitu highlighted was the issue of profit making in education. I think that's one of the most important findings of this report, among its many important findings, is its clear recommendation against profit making in education, and saying that profit making is inconsistent with the goal of free pre-primary through secondary education. And in particular, I think it's really crucial that there's a recommendation to regulate or ban profit making in order to ensure that equity is protected in school systems. And I think it's really, really important that this report also cautions against the idea of sort of educational markets and the idea that competition between providers is necessarily a good thing. And that instead sort of new ideas need to be shared in dialogue for the common good. And that's really important for some of the key institutions that we advocate with. It's important for the IFC, the World Bank's IFC, as they consider the future of their temporary freeze on investments in for-profit schools globally. We need to fight to continue that freeze and to make it institutionalized in World Bank policy. It continues to be relevant for US aid, which, as Priya has mentioned, has pivoted recently to more funding directed to for-profit approaches in education, which is very problematic. There's many other important recommendations in this report. A strong reminder that education must always be free, that school fees have no place in equitable education systems, the importance of public investment. I think recommendation against selection of students by schools. Many strong recommendations in this report that I really encourage you to read it in more detail. A couple of things I would have liked to have seen the report kind of go a little bit further. I would have liked to have seen it come out more strongly on the harmful role of privatized education systems, or sort of public-private partnerships as a policy approach, because of the concerns about how they exacerbate educational inequalities. The report says that publicly financed need not mean publicly provided if equity can be ensured. However, I would ask, in the real world, is this really possible? And does the evidence really tell us that this is happening anywhere in the world? And the report acknowledges this by saying that contracting out public school management to private providers, policies like educational vouchers, can easily, quote, end up benefiting learners who are well off. And that is certainly the case in terms of the evidence that we've seen, the case studies that we've conducted in countries like Pakistan and Uganda, where the evidence suggests that this exclusion is a feature of such privatized education delivery arrangements. And so I think that really we have to look at the conclusions of this report and take it a step further. Also, I think the report skims over the responsibility of governments as clearly defined in international human rights law to be duty bearers, not to just guarantee the right to education, but also be the primary providers of education. Note, I didn't say only provider because international human rights law protects the right of parents to choose the kind of education they want for their children, but it's about where do we put public funding. And these provisions of international human rights law are further explained and interpreted by the Abidjan Principles. And I would just note in the chat that Shujana from Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has noted that that is, has been a crucial resource that was created by and endorsed by international human rights experts as a resource for sort of unpacking and understanding how governments and policies can protect and fulfill the right to education for all children in the context of private actors. So with that, I want to take some of your questions. There are, I'm sure, many. And so let's see, I'm just looking here to see where we have hands raised. I see Alejandro. Lara, I'm going to just take a batch. So Alejandro, go ahead.
Yes, good morning all. Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. I have one general comment and one suggestion for Jitu and a question for Priya, if you mind, very briefly. First of all, my position about free education, I don't truly believe in it. I believe that 100% free education must have a commitment to the individual. So something that if you provide free education, the individual must commit to give back it to their communities in some kind of work. So it shouldn't be 100% free education for sake. I am anti that strategy. For G2, if you mind, please, I would love to participate in September. Now, when you speak about equity, or when I hear about equity, I feel like I'm being left out because I'm a Hispanic origin, and it seems to me that most times when you when individuals like yourself talk about equity, it's being always phrased or it's always targeting a specific segment of the population, which is the Black population, which to me, all the time, I feel, honestly, I feel always left out because being a Hispanic community, the Hispanic origin. So I would love to participate in September. However, it should be more like, wide explain what is being targeted to. I mean, it should be include perhaps the minority words, targeting minorities overall. So that's my suggestion, and hopefully I get a comment from you about that. And for Priya, thank you very much. It's very interesting. If I have a specific question, if you have the power to push a button right now, not to disconnect from this meeting, but to push a button to give us homework. You have a group of soldiers here, a platoon of 50 people participating in this meeting. And if you have a button to say, hey, you guys have homework today for tomorrow, what would be your top 2 priorities for us to do out of the report? Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. We're just going to take a few more here. I see we have a question in the chat from Sirik Milanovic, and feel free to jump in and speak yourself if you would prefer. But I'm just going to read it out here. Have you looked into, this is a question for Priya, have you looked into boarding schools and inclusion or exclusion of children with disabilities and children living in institutions? And then I see a comment from Sandrine. Sandrine, do you want to come in, and or Trufena? with questions. We have a comment. How, if there's no support from the government, can we sustain the services we offer to those people, most especially here in Africa? Apologies, can you hear me? Oh, Sandrine's mic has a problem, okay. And then another comment, when we talk of free and equitable education in Africa, especially in Kenya, this is not feasible as public schools where education is free. We cannot define what is equitable education or resources are inadequate. While in private schools where most of the policymakers take their children, therefore equitable education in Kenya has not been achieved. So those are comments. Yes.
Yes, greeting. I'm sorry if I can just ask the question to the panel.
Thank you. Yes.
This is Dr. Onaje Mawid from Philadelphia, Chester area. And my question is, have any of you dovetailed your work inside of the decade for people of African descent from 2015 to 2024 with the three primary principles of recognition, of justice, and of development? And if so, if you can share with us what those activities have been, or invite you to participate in it, because I see education as just as similarly as finances connected to the colonial project. And if we're not in the position of understanding that we are actually decolonizing education, then we're just kind of allowing things just to go, repeatedly in circles. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Sirik, do you want to come in briefly, and then we'll turn to Priya and Jitu for responses?
Yes, thank you very much, Dragana here. I asked my question initially after Priya's presentation, but I guess that it really can be asked also to Professor Brown, because we are looking into overlap between the treatment and segregation of children with disabilities, along with First Nation in Canada, African American population in US. It happened, something similar happened in Australia as well, but also looking into Africa's situation, and as just mentioned, colonialism and use of boarding schools to segregate children, including children with disabilities. So I'm interested in this this overlap, because I think that not only children with disabilities, but many other children are affected by the same problem. And we recently heard that some institutions have been renamed basically into boarding schools. So the access of education has been misused, abused, to segregate, to institutionalize children. And that is something I think we need to address as well. So thank you very much. That's where my question is coming from.
Thank you so much, Dragana. Okay, so we're going to turn to you first, Priya, and then you, Jitu, if you could sort of in about 3 minutes or less, respond and try to wrap up, because I know we have another agenda item for this meeting. That would be great. Thank you so much.
I'll do my best. I think, first of all, this question of free education. Education, of course, has a cost. And I think responding to Alejandro as well as Katie, the question is, what is happening? Why is the system becoming more regressive as a system? Right? Like it has to be paid by through some pockets. Why is there not a functional tax system that is actually, delivering education in the most equitable way? That is the first issue. The free education, when we study parents and their decision making, it's true what Alejandro is saying. Some people will say, I would rather pay because am I out of pocket, so that I feel like some sort of ownership of the fact that I paid. Is because the sort of the link between, especially not in America, but let's say other countries, what we have is a lack of a link between the fact that you're paying into the government system and the fact that the government then is the duty bearer to pay for education. It's not a simple issue, but I think a lot of people do not view these as very isolated things. They're all connected in the great issue of finance, no? So, and I think what we're seeing as a problem globally as well as in the US is that people are taking steps to make it a more and more regressive system. The burden is being shifted more and more to the poor. When you look at the poorest countries of the world, they are shouldering so much of the burden. Households are sharing so much of the burden, and then within each country, the poor are sharing shouldering so much of the burden. That's why so many people are going into debt, at every income level. So these are the challenges we're talking about when we're talking about we need free education, that the government has to fund this education. And that is, I would say, still priority number one. Why have we not, when Jitu was saying not meeting equity mandates is the same thing as donors. Donors had in the global sphere sort of a commitment to fund, I forget now exactly what percentage of their GDP. It has never been met, and I think Oxfam would be the right place to talk about this issue. So I think it's this question of, thinking about finance and the freeness of education all as one, into like one picture. There's the individual response, and then there's the system response. Is the system actually trying to improve, from whatever situation it is in, or is it actually getting worse? The second thing, I think, in terms of your two top priorities, of course, all 5 recommendations are very important. I feel like what Katie had mentioned, and I think, this like success of the for-profit, reducing for-profit activity in the primary and secondary, the compulsory education sphere. One of the challenges here is that everything beyond that, right? So private tutoring, technology, textbooks, the industry, like all of these industries are better spaces and less discussed and less attacked, so people find comfort in sort of diversifying their portfolio and going into those spheres of influence. And that, I think, is one of the reasons we did this global report, not just on schools, but on, the entire system of education. Technology companies, textbook companies, we've given examples of Pearson, we've, all kinds of examples on like what is happening. And in terms of, I think, just the heat on these, activities, right? And then, of course, all these blind spots of regulations. There's just so much out there. And I feel like that is what people need to educate themselves even more on, especially the advocates who are really, very aware of these, like what the, let's say 5 years from now, what the consequences of all of this will be, with COVID and with all of the dramatic changes that are happening now. And I think and I think, of course, one of the reasons the report is trying to be subtle, and I mean, the reality is so different, right? It's the way I had even pitched the presentation. When we will hear from people from Kenya and other places that public education financing has not been adequate and the quality is not as good. That is why, the policy, like the politicians send their children to the private schools. I am from Nepal. I've never set foot in a public school in Nepal because, by the time I was growing up, my parents' generation were going to public schools. There were fewer, but they were going to, what was designed as a public system, even though it was a smaller system. By the time I was going to school, no one was going to public education. And I think that is a question of government capacity, and government intent, capacity plus intent. Because there used to be in 2015 when we were talking about the EFA agenda, there used to be a slide that we showed, which was like, we could like fund all of education with like three like days of defense spending of the US or something like that. And then someone was like, this is very old, stop showing this. But I was like, it's still true. It's still the same point. I don't know if, so I feel like this question of, let's get more money, private financing to fill these gaps and all of these activities, the evidence has not panned out. Of course, I mean, you cannot say that it's such a diverse picture. You cannot say that everyone's bad and everyone's good, but I feel like that core, that the public system has to make this happen, given the decades of experience, I mean, the centuries of experience we've had in better functioning systems, it just has not come to bear, and I feel like it's getting worse. The technology example is a very big one. The COVID technology, technology as the solution for all of our problems today, it just does not compute, with our reality globally. I mean, the richest countries, the richest families around the world have had a hard time, learning online. Can you just imagine what it means, globally? So I feel that is my response. Thank you.
Thanks, Priya. G2, we'll turn it to you for the last word.
Yeah, Priya, I was laughing because I've heard that argument too when you talk about, well, you only spend, 3% of the GDP on education. Why don't you spend more? And then everyone, you always get this, like that's an old liberal argument. But I think that's to the point. And I want to respond, Brother Alejandro, to your piece too. We are trying to make a meal out of a rotten apple, right? We're acting as if this just needs to be tweaked when it needs to be transformed, right? If we were able to build a national organization in like a month with dozens of cities, that tells you that you have all these people who feel disenfranchised. When you drive down American streets and any American city, and you go to the expressway and you see all these homeless people, and you see homeless encampments all over the place, all over the United States. It's speaking to, we don't have an issue problem. We have a value system problem. So do we believe, and I'm not trying to give a rah-rah speech, I'm asking a serious question. Do we believe that we have the capacity to make change? Because what needs to happen, and this goes to what Alejandro said, brother, I didn't mean it in a way that was exclusionary. And I would respectfully, and I've had to do this myself, so I would respectfully challenge the lens in which you or the way you heard what I said, because one of the things that has been denied Black, brown, and indigenous communities is the right to self-determination, to define, name, and speak for ourselves instead of being defined, named, and spoken for by others. There is a long and proud history, an uninhibited Black, Chicano, Native American people became brothers and sisters, knowing what they were fighting. There's a long history of this, right? So what I would say in the Equity or Else campaign is that we are calling, our platform is to build a Black, brown, and indigenous quality of life agenda. Right. And when Latino families come and say, this is what we want for education, it's not for me to say that's right or wrong. Sister, brother, you got the right to want that. You want language justice. You want English language learners and the resources for English language learners in every school. Absolutely. So, but what's been denied us is the right to self-determination, to define, name, and speak for ourselves instead of being defined, named, and spoken for by others. And I would challenge another term. I would never on this platform call you or somebody that looks like me a minority, because on the planet we are not. The term minority has been used to marginalize us. We are global people. And so you are welcome, brother. Like, if I could hug you right now, I would. You are welcome. September 20th, what we do is we organize listening sessions with communities all over the country. And those listening sessions inform what ultimately will be this Black, brown, and indigenous quality of life platform. This is not new work. We know that there have been several times in history where people organize that way. But what's happened is when philanthropy has guided how people organize, it's become more issue-based. We're trying to build an agenda that is more values-based. Education does not need to be tweaked. It needs to be transformed. Because if you pay taxes, and I'm not knowledgeable about the tax infrastructure of different countries, so I won't speak to it. But I know in America, if you pay taxes, whether you pay a mortgage or you buy a bag of damn potato chips, you have the right to expect a reasonable return on your investment. And that means that if I pay taxes, then I should be able to send my child to a good school within safe walking distance of my home. That's it. That's it. And if my child goes down the street and there's no technology, there's no world language, he's being treated like a criminal when he walks in the building, that's not my fault as a parent. That's the belief system of the society I live in, infesting that school with that belief that my child is a criminal. Values are beliefs that govern your behavior. So If we don't have control over the institutions in our communities, then people run those institutions based on their opinions of us, not on the truth. So what I'm trying to offer you all today, sisters and brothers, is from the grassroots. You know, we have to have clarity in how we advocate. It's got to be rooted in the real experiences and realities of our people, not in what the colonial powers teach us every day. That's it.
I'll be looking for that hug due to in September.
That's great.
Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead, Katie.
Just a powerful call for the need to join in global solidarity to defend and promote public education. So thanks everyone, and apologies that we ran a few minutes late.
Thank you all for your powerful remarks, Jitu and Priya, as well as Katie. We're so honored to have had you, and it's such an important point that we really need to invest in the education of all our children for a better society. So thank you so much. We're going to transition now to welcome our new Global Campaign for Education US Coalition member. We're so honored to have humanity and inclusion in our coalition, and we have Casey Recabarren presenting today as the Inclusive Education Policy and Development Officer. So over to you, Casey.
Hello, everyone. Well, I'm incredibly humbled to follow that discussion. Pretty sure there should have been a mic drop after Priya and Jitu just spoke. For inclusive purposes, if my video shows, I am light skin, dark hair with a black shirt and glasses and a white background. I have had the pleasure of meeting some of you, but for those of you who haven't, my name is Casey Recabarren. We can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. And I am the Inclusive Education Policy and Development Officer for HI here in the US. I have been in the inclusive education field for over 15 years, and many of those years have been spent in a global context. I lived and worked in Ghana for many years and worked in the autism community. In 2011, I founded the Autism Society of West Africa, which was the host to multiple grassroots level international autism conferences. I have a bachelor's degree in speech therapy and a master's in public health. And last but not least, I am the mother to a 1- and a 3-year-old child. Before coming to HI, I was an instructor at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, where I am actually currently based. Thanks, next slide. So HI the Federation is based in France and was established 40 years ago this year. Its original mission was supporting refugees who had acquired a physical disability due to a landmine accident. HI supported through providing prosthetics, rehabilitation, and risk reduction education. This is still a foundational piece to our mission. Today, we have deminers in the field. We actively support campaigns to ban landmines and cluster munitions. HI has been a key player in the adoption of 2 international disarmament treaties, and one of which made HI the recipient of a Nobel Peace Prize. Since this point, HI has expanded its mission quite significantly based on the obligations from the UN CRPD and the Sustainable Development Goals. We have support programs in inclusive health, rehabilitation, social and economic inclusion, humanitarian assistance, of course, inclusive education, and many other areas. Next slide, please. So in 2020, HI had about 4,700 staff across the world. As you'll see, the vast majority of which are actually people working in country on the ground. We're in 59 countries and have 420 projects. This, of course, changes based on the different contracts at the time. And then in 2020, it was estimated that we had a direct impact on almost 4 million recipients. Next slide, please. HIUS is a national association. We are one of 8 national associations in the world. Our executive director is Jeff Muir, who I believe is joining our call today. We have technical expertise in disability advocacy, inclusive food security, inclusive health, inclusive governance, and now inclusive education, and actually soon to be inclusive livelihoods. Next slide, please. I am in the inclusive education team with 3 others. I'm sure many of you have worked with my esteemed colleagues throughout the years. The 4 of us manage 52 inclusive education projects over 27 countries. So that's about half of all the HI countries have some sort of inclusive education project running currently. And of those projects, 15 are in emergency contexts, which is something HI expanded to supporting in 2015. Next slide, please. I think probably many of you are familiar with the twin track approach. It's the idea that we, of course, need to support on an individual level, looking at the unique needs of persons with disabilities, but also understanding that that doesn't go far enough to really impact full inclusion of persons with disabilities. And so we need to mainstream disability and support at a community level and a systems level to really impact change at the greatest level. Next slide, please. So what this means for inclusive education sector is that we intervene actually at 3 levels: on an individual level, in direct support, at a community level, and a national level. And I will talk about examples of each one of these. Next slide, please. So looking at direct support, what does this look like? Some examples are providing assistive technology, and that could be a wheelchair, prosthetics, or glasses. We help local teams to adapt resources and their curriculum. We do lots of teacher trainings in building internal capacity for teachers to identify the needs of their learners and identifying IEPs, individual education plans. Next slide, please. We also intervene at a community level, and that could be things like barrier assessments. And because of course we know many children with disabilities aren't actually in schools, and so understanding why that is and helping to adapt the greater community to make schools more accessible. One of the big pieces of that is actually making their bathrooms or washrooms more accessible. We give caregiver trainings and support, building parent capacity to better support their children with disabilities. We run advocacy and awareness campaigns, and we do help to better identify children with disabilities in the community. Next slide, please. Examples at a national level, many times this looks like partnering with the Ministry of Education. One of the greatest examples and most current examples is our partnership with the government of Sierra Leone. And we help to design their inclusive curriculum on a national level, as well as inputting on their national policy for inclusion. Next slide, please. None of this would be possible without all of our collaborators. We're very active, as most of you know, in our networks, including GCE UK, France, Belgium, and GCE International. All of our work is done in partnership, again, with many of you that are on this call today. And none of us would be here without the support of all of our very generous donors. And that is it. Thank you so much, and would love to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Casey. We love the presentation, and we're so delighted to have you in the coalition. I think in the interest of time, we'll hand over to Taylor to give a few announcements and then go from there.
Great, thanks, Krista. So just wanted to say a brief thank you to everyone who submitted for the USAID local capacity development policy feedback. We got all of that information together and submitted it yesterday. So thank you to everyone who submitted feedback to us to then submit to USAID. And then on a different note, GCEUS and multiple partners came together on January 20th to present the Global Disability Summit Inclusive Education Thematic Workshop. We were really delighted with the great turnout and really grateful for all the wonderful participation from many of our partners, including many of you on this call. I'll include a link in the chat just to give some more details for the event that you can see on our website. And then in coordination with the partners from this event, we put together a call to action which you can view at the link that should be going into the chat now as well. These recommendations are based on the menu of commitments developed by the GDS 22 organizers, and they point to responsibilities and actions that are needed to implement the CRPD Article 24 and achieve SDG 4 by for, by, and with learners with disabilities, realizing the right to education for all. And although the official deadline to submit commitments has passed, the GDS Secretariat will still be collecting commitments, some of which we anticipate will be announced during the Global Disability Summit itself. And we're hoping that this call to action will urge governments and other important stakeholders to make bold commitments towards investing in inclusive education and lifelong learning for learners with disabilities now and in years to come. So those links are in the chat now if you would like to learn more about those topics. Thank you.
Thanks, Taylor, so much for that. We also wanted to highlight a few other exciting events and opportunities. As Taylor mentioned, we had the Global and Inclusive Education Thematic Workshop as part of the lead up to the Global Disability Summit. The official Global Disability Summit starts on Valentine's Day, February 14th, and lasts until the 17th. So we'll put the link there in the chat for you to register. We'd love for you to be a part of that. It's being co-hosted this year by the governments of Ghana and Norway. And we'd really love to see global participation and turnout. And we appreciate the many ways in which you've been engaging with us already in the lead up. We are also in collaboration with Save the Children Norway, with the Global Campaign for Education Secretariat, and several other partners, including the people from the GEM report team. We're delighted to be co-hosting a side event as part of the Global Disability Summit. This will take place in the Eastern Time Zone at 12 to 1 p.m. on February 16th. We'll include the link to register for that in the chat as well. So I will put both of those links right now before we move on. So here's the GDS. Oh, thank you, Jennifer. Already done. Thank you so much. We also wanted to highlight that we are going into, from a US government advocacy perspective, the start of the FY23 appropriation cycle. And we would really appreciate your edits and feedback on the appropriations report language with and track changes, please, or suggestion mode via Google Docs. We'd really appreciate receiving those by this Friday, February 4th. So we will include that link in the chat as well for you to incorporate any changes. And this is mostly goes for people who are US based and have interest in lobbying US government for education. We're delighted to also include a link to register for the next coalition meeting. To get that on your calendars, that will be Wednesday, March 2nd. And already thinking into March, and it's only the first day of February, that will be also at 9 a.m., 9 to 10:30 a.m. Eastern time zone. And then beyond that, we are planning for the Inclusive Education and Early Childhood Community of Practice meeting at the end of March. Just to get that on your calendars, that will be March 30th at 9 a.m. as well. So we'll include all of those links in the chat, and we're so grateful for your participation today and for our wonderful speakers, for their passion that they have for education, and for all of the many ways in which you all are on this call are advocating for education within your organizations and communities and societies. And we're so grateful to partner and be a part of this global movement. So many thanks to you all.
Thanks, Krista. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Ano sa yung blanket? Ano sa labas?